Okay, so today we are diving into the world of podcast websites. You sent over some really fascinating articles about engaging websites in general, but we're focusing on how those ideas work specifically for podcasts, because it's not just about having a website, right?
Yeah.
It's about making it a place where someone who's just checking you out for the first time can become a diehard fan.
Yeah, totally. It can be so much more than like a little online billboard for your podcast. Like it can actually be this awesome hub where people connect and feel like they're part of something.
Right. It's totally different, like just hearing a song you kind of dig versus going to a live show and feeling that energy with a crowd.
100%. And one thing that really jumped out at me from these articles is how crucial it is to have a really well-organized episode list. Like that's the core of your website.
It's true. If your episode list is a mess, it's like having a library where all the books are just shoved onto shelves randomly.
And no one wants to deal with that. The articles really hammer home how important it is to make your episodes super easy to find. So having a strong search bar that lets people search by keyword or topic or date, that's huge. So listeners can get to exactly what they're looking for.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to scroll through like a million years of episodes if they're looking for one specific one from a while back.
Exactly. And ideally, each episode should have its own page with a good description and show notes. It's kind of like a movie trailer. Give people a sneak peek of what the episode's about and make them want to hit play.
Yeah, like a little behind-the-scenes teaser. Now, something else the articles call out as super important for keeping listeners coming back are subscribe buttons. They call them like the holy grail of listener retention. What are your thoughts?
They're essential. You absolutely have to make it incredibly easy for someone who's enjoying an episode to subscribe for more. And just having a generic subscribe button somewhere on your site isn't enough. You want those buttons to be impossible to miss, and they need to be the same on every single page. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever your audience hangs out.
Yeah, like you're leaving a trail of breadcrumbs, but instead of a gingerbread house, it leads to awesome podcast content.
Exactly. Fewer clicks is always better. Okay, shifting gears a bit, one of the articles dives into the power of the host bio. And they talk about going beyond just listing your accomplishments and actually letting your personality shine through.
You know, I'm all about that personal touch. I'm always curious about the hosts of podcasts I like. What do you think it is about that works so well?
I think it goes back to that connection thing we were talking about. People connect with other people, right? And when you share little stories or behind-the-scenes stuff or even just fun facts, it helps listeners feel like they actually know you a little. And when we feel like we know someone, even if it's just through a podcast, we're way more likely to trust them and feel like we have something in common with them.
It's true. It's like you're inviting them into your world just a bit, letting them see what makes you tick.
And that authenticity is so powerful. It builds a level of trust and loyalty that a super generic bio just never could.
It's so true. It really is like instead of reading some company's website, you're actually getting coffee with the person who started it, and they're telling you their story.
Yeah.
100%.
So ready to switch gears a little bit, let's talk about merch.
Okay, I'll admit it. I used to think podcast merch was kind of cheesy.
Yeah.
But then I saw this one podcast. They were selling these mugs with inside jokes from their episodes, and I was like, I need that.
Yeah.
So how can podcasts use merch in a way that's actually smart?
Yeah. It can be awesome if you do it right. It's not about just putting your logo on a t-shirt and calling it a day. It's more about making something that your listeners will actually care about and want to use.
Yeah, it's like you're giving them a little piece of the podcast that they can hold on to.
Exactly. And it can be a fun way to build up that community we were just talking about.
Totally. Imagine seeing someone at the store wearing a shirt from your favorite podcast, instant conversation starter.
Exactly. And while we're on the topic of connecting with listeners, one of the articles talks about how important it is to have listener testimonials on your website.
Oh man, testimonials are huge GE.
Yeah.
It's like when you're trying to pick a restaurant and you see one with tons of 5-star reviews, you're instantly way more down to try it.
It goes back to that social proof idea. We're just more likely to trust something if we see other people have had a good experience with it.
Yeah, and with podcasts, it's not even just about is the audio quality good? It's about hearing how the podcast has actually impacted people, what they learned, if it changed how they think about things.
Right. Those real stories are so powerful. They make your podcast way more credible, and they can really encourage new listeners to check it out.
It's like having a friend tell you, yo, you got to listen to this podcast.
Totally. And everybody loves a good recommendation, right?
Yeah.
Actually, speaking of things that click with listeners, I wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier about those host bios.
Yeah, totally. I'm always so interested in how those little personal details can make you feel like you almost know the hosts already.
Well, there's actually a really interesting psychology principle at play here that one of the articles talks about. It's called the mere exposure effect.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
So basically, it says that the more we're exposed to something, the more we tend to like it.
So when we share those stories and let listeners into our lives a little, it makes them more familiar with us.
Exactly. And that familiarity leads to more fondness, which, like we said, can make people trust you more and be more loyal.
Right. It's like the more you get to know someone, the more you appreciate all those little quirks that make them who they are.
And the more likely you are to support their work and want to see them do well.
Makes total sense. Okay, we've covered a lot here. Episode listings, subscribe buttons, host bios, merch, testimonials. That's a lot to think about.
It is. But the cool thing about these articles is they don't just give you this list of things to check off. They really encourage you to get creative with how you use them.
Yeah, like those are the ground rules, but you can totally put your own spin on it and let your personality come through.
Exactly. That's how you make a podcast website really stand out.
Right. Ultimately, you want your website to be an extension of the podcast itself. You want it to have that same energy.
Exactly. It's about creating that same feeling across the board so that whether someone's listening to an episode or checking out your website, it's all part of the same awesome experience.
I love that. So with all that in mind, what are some of the most creative or memorable ways you've seen these ideas used in the wild?
Oh man, that's a great question. One that pops into my head is this one podcast I listened to. They had a really cool approach to their episode list. Instead of just having it in chronological order, they made these themed collections based on different things their listeners are into.
Oh, that's smart. That way, if someone's new to the podcast, they can find a bunch of episodes that are perfect for them.
Right. It made going back through their older episodes so much more fun.
Totally. Because instead of just seeing a million episodes, you're like, ooh, what's in this collection? This sounds cool.
Yeah. And it showed that they really get their audience and want to make it easy for them to find the good stuff.
Such a good example of thinking outside the box. Any other memorable ones?
Oh yeah, speaking of thinking outside the box, I saw this other podcast that got really creative with their merch store.
Ooh, tell me more. I'm always down to hear about cool podcast merch.
So instead of selling just the typical t-shirts and mugs, they teamed up with this local artist to make limited edition prints inspired by different episodes.
Wow, that's so cool. It's like the merch becomes this piece of art that you want to collect.
Exactly.
Okay.
And it was a huge hit with their listeners because it matched the style of the podcast and it supported a local artist.
It's like they found that sweet spot where their brand, their values, and what their listeners care about all come together.
Exactly. And that's what it's all about, right? Finding those genuine connections.
100%.
Okay.
Okay, so before we wrap up this section, I want to hear from some real people about how these website features have actually made a difference for them.
Let's do it. Let's hear what our fellow deep divers have to say.
Okay. This first one is from Sarah, and she says, I didn't used to think podcast websites were a big deal, but I just found out my favorite podcast has this awesome website with detailed show notes, guest bios, even transcripts. It's become my favorite place to go to learn more about the stuff they talk about on the show.
It shows you how a website can be like this extra layer to the podcast itself.
Yeah, like a study guide for your favorite show.
Exactly. And it just shows you how much listeners appreciate having access to all that extra info.
Totally. Okay, this next one's from David, and he says, the host bio section on this one podcast website is literally why I started listening. Hearing their stories and where they came from made me feel like I already knew them, and I instantly connected with what they were talking about.
There you go. The power of connection. It's about making people feel like they're part of the conversation, not just listening in.
Right, because the more you know about the people behind the voices, the more their words resonate with you.
100%. And that connection can be the difference between someone hitting that subscribe button or moving on to the next thing.
So true. All right, last one. This is from Maria, and she says, I never thought I'd buy merch from a podcast, but then I saw that my favorite one had teamed up with this charity. I love to make this limited edition t-shirt. Some of the money from each sale went to the charity, and I knew I had to get one. It's such a cool design, and it's a great conversation starter.
That is so great. It just shows you that merch can be about way more than just making money.
Right. It can be a way to give back to support something you believe in and to bring listeners together even more.
And it shows how powerful it is to have merch that represents your values and the things your audience cares about.
Totally. It's about making something meaningful that people will be stoked to wear.
For sure. Okay, so we've heard from the experts, we've heard from listeners, and we've looked at some real-world examples.
And I think the big takeaway here is that having a really well-designed website can be a total game changer for podcasts.
It can make the difference between just having people casually listen and having a whole community of super fans.
It's about creating an experience that goes beyond just the audio.
It's about giving your listeners a place to connect and engage and dive deeper into the world you've created with your podcast.
Yes, and as always here on The Deep Dive, it's not just about getting all this information. It's about actually doing something with it.
100%. So to everyone listening, think about your own podcast website.
How can you use these ideas? What are some creative things you can do to make these features your own?
Your website is like your own little corner of the internet. Don't be afraid to experiment, have fun, and see what works.
Because at the end of the day, it's all about creating something genuine that you're proud of and that connects with the people who matter most, your listeners.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Okay, before we completely wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought-provoking question.
Ooh. I love ending on a thought-provoking note. What's up? Lay it on me.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about all the stuff you can have on your website, right? Like your episodes, your bio merch, testimonials. But what if we zoom out a little? What if instead of thinking about them as all these separate things, we think about how they all work together to show what your podcast is all about?
I like that. So it's like, yeah, each piece is important on its own, but they also need to come together and tell the same story.
Yes. You want your listeners to have that same experience, whether they're listening to an episode or on your website or even wearing your merch. It all goes back to the same brand.
So your website shouldn't just be some random website. It should feel like your podcast.
Exactly. Like think about your podcast's vibe. Is it funny and light? Is it more like you're thinking really hard about something? Your website needs to have that same energy.
Yeah, totally. And what about all those things that make a podcast special? Like maybe you do this one segment every time, or you have a catchphrase, or even a certain sound effect. Can you work that stuff into your website to make it even cooler?
Totally. Those little details make a big difference. It's all about getting creative and finding ways to make your website feel like your podcast.
This has been awesome. I feel like I have a totally new understanding of how important podcast websites are.
Me too. I'm so glad we had this chat.
And to everyone listening, we hope you got some good ideas for your own websites. Remember, it's all about making something that feels like you and that lets you connect with your audience on a deeper level.
And have fun with it. Don't be afraid to let your creativity go wild.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
All right, until next time, keep making awesome content, and we'll catch you on the flip side.